Billy Blue, my knight in shining brindle. Welcome to another episode of A Poet Reads to Write. Today, I thought I would take a look at that genre of the literary biography. For me, when I am approaching a new author, I often like to start with a good biography. For some reason, for me, the way I read texts, for some reason for me, knowing something about the life that has created all these new books that I'm starting my adventure in discovering, for me, knowing something about the life just opens up so much more connectivity and association for me. It gives me different ways of reading texts and of understanding them and of, bringing connections between texts in and out of the life and of that, this writer with other writers and who their possible influences are. And for me, it always helps. So I've always loved the literary biography. And BookTube, this is one of the great revelations for me of joining BookTube and getting involved with it. I have never enjoyed, or I've never felt attracted to horror. I don't watch any horror on TV. And I don't read any horror, or haven't as yet. And I also don't enjoy true crime. The voyeuristic component of some, at least, true crime really worries me. I know there's that really powerful book by Truman Capote, In Cold Blood, and that's a really powerful true crime type work. But for me, much true crime, particularly more popular variants of true crime, are very voyeuristic and are almost turning other people's grief and suffering into entertainment that I find very worrying and unsettling. And I guess I've approached horror much the same way. I've never watched it, I've never read it. But since going on to BookTube, so many of the booktubers who I follow and I watch their videos, they've been inspiring me to give horror a go. And so I decided a few months ago that I would buy some Shirley Jackson as my debut into this new genre, and I would give Shirley Jackson a go. And as I just said, as per my custom, I decided to get a biography first before I started looking at the novels. And the biography that I came across, that I found, was this one by Ruth Franklin, Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life. And it's a terrific biography, a great read, very, very detailed, and uncovered quite a few insights by discovering new diaries and new letters by Shirley Jackson that had not been apparently read or taken into consideration by other biographers. So this is a really interesting book. But for me, approaching a literary biography, I'm always a little bit miffed that so many biographers seem to think that a biography is simply an incredibly detailed, well-written recount of a person's life, as though we can understand somebody just by thinking about the things they did, the things they said, the way their life possibly panned out, assuming that they were in control of the decision-making processes that got them to this point. And so this idea that you can somehow understand a life by simply recounting the series of events that it went through, I think is a little bit mind-boggling for me. Even 400, going back to the early 20th century, late 19th century, there was, with the beginning of psychology and psychoanalysis, there was this newfound emphasis on the subconscious, on those interior headspaces, and the way the subconscious can, if you like, predetermine so many of our actions, the rhythms of our, workaday lives. so much of what we do, so much of what we say, so much of what we eventually become is preordained through things like the subconscious. And even if we assume, like some philosophers have wanted to, like for example, Sartre, for example, who really wanted to de-emphasize the subconscious because he believed that humans had free will and that we had to be in fact free will, that we were in fact condemned to be free according to Sartre. But, even going back 400 years, at the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, so many Protestant theologians, of course, because they wanted to cling to this idea of an all-powerful, all-knowing God, for so many of these early Protestant theologians, like Calvin, like Knox, like even Luther, so many of these theologians, to keep the idea that they wanted of an all-powerful, all-knowing God, they came up with this idea of predestination, that people, before they were born, before they were conceived, were already preordained by this all-powerful deity to heaven or to hell. Because for them, if God is all-powerful, how can a fallible, weak human being say yes or no to that knocking on their heart's door by Christ? And so for these sorts of people, these early Christian philosophers, theologians, the only way around the problem was this crude, reductionist way of looking at things, that God is all-powerful, God is all-knowing, and therefore for them, God preordains some to heaven and some to hell. And while modern-day philosophers and most neuroscientists would completely reject any notions about all-powerful, all-knowing deities, so they don't have that problem. But for many philosophers and neuroscientists working in the field today, they also would now begin to question free will. Many neuroscientists in particular, coming from their very scientific, materialistic way of looking at things, they're now performing many experiments. They're creating incredibly imaginative, visionary experiments to test free will, to test how much free will we actually have. Is it real or is it a sham thing? Is it even a controller mechanism for, that has simply come about with our evolution as ways of becoming social animals? So for many neuroscientists in particular, in experiment after experiment, they're coming up with one conclusion. For most neuroscientists today, we do not have free will. Most things in our life are preordained, if you like. And they're not preordained by God or by anything like that, of course. It is a complicated story of nurture and nature. But for most neuroscientists today, there's a real erosion in the capacity, or at least in the belief, that it is us who decide the course of our life. Most neuroscientists today would really question that. And they would see, that we have the appearance of making decisions. We have the appearance, if you like, of self-control. But most neuroscientists today would actually argue that free will is an illusion. Like pulling, the magician pulling that old rabbit out of the hat. It's an illusion. We think we have free will. We appear to have it as we make decisions right through the day. But they would actually argue something quite different. And of course they would argue that's hardly surprising, since we are made from matter which is clearly determined. The incredible universe, the multiverse even possibly, being revealed today by physics, is a universe that is ordained, isn't it? The movement of planets, the movement of our universe away from that centrality of, that point of singularity of the explosion of the Big Bang, and the way everything is moving out and away from that point of singularity. The way stars are born and then die and become themselves black holes. The movement of matter is ordained. And no, it's not ordained by God. If you like, it's ordained by the laws of physics. But, we are made from determined stuff. We are made from matter that does seem to be determined. And there doesn't seem to be much elbow room for free will, for self-autonomy in the universe, the multiverse, being revealed to us by physics. And neuroscientists certainly would seem to agree with that. In experiment after experiment, free will would appear to be illusion. There are some philosophers who would caution us, however, on that tightrope of the neuroscientists. There are some philosophers like Daniel Dennett who would really caution us to be wary. He would argue that yes, we need to take the neuroscience seriously. We need to read it, and it needs to inform our decisions, our ideas about ways of approaching free will and whether it is real or a sham, an illusion. But Daniel Dennett would argue that the answer for this is in fact not in physics, where everything is determined, but he would argue that the answer is in fact in biology. And he would argue in particular that what human beings do have is a capacity through imagination, through empathy, through the way our brain works. What we do have, even if we are not self-governing autonomous agents, and Daniel Dennett also does not think we are that. He thinks we have a type of free will, but it's not the type that we've always taken for granted as having. For Daniel Dennett, what we do have is a capacity to imagine possible futures and to not necessarily simply choose between them, but he would argue that we have the capacity to make some decisions that would make certain futures more likely than other futures. So we do have, through imagination, through empathy, a type of free will, a type of decision making. And Daniel Dennett described this in this particular book. It's a wonderful work of philosophy in that English language analytic school called Elbow Room, The Varieties of Free Will Worth Wanting. So Daniel Dennett loves the neuroscience. He thinks we need to be informed by it, but he cautions us to be wary. He would not be quite so pessimistic as what most of the neuroscientists are today. He would argue we do have some type of free will, but how that works needs to be radically redefined. Coming back to the literary biography, I'm always a bit miffed with biographies that so many literary biographers simply have this idea that it is enough to simply recount a life. This idea that you can understand another human being simply by recounting the details of their life. And this is another one of these books. It's a beautifully written book. It's a rollicking great yarn. I had such a ball reading it from start to finish. It was a page turner. And it's very, very detailed. You can see how big it is. This is a big, substantial book. Very, very detailed. And Ruth Franklin has uncovered new diaries and new letters that had never been read or seen before. So there is some new information in this book. But my problem is, can you understand a person simply by recounting the facts of their life? And so many literary biographies, including Ruth Franklin, seem to me to basically have that as their idea. For me, it's a little bit mind-boggling. I don't think you can understand a person really by simply recounting their life story. If you go to a psychologist today, if you go to a psychoanalyst today, they're never going to be simply getting you to recount your life, are you? Or are they, sorry? There is an understanding that to get to the root of my problems, the source of my mental collapse, my anxiety, my depression, to get at the source of all these things, it is much more complicated than simply getting them or getting me to recount the story of my life. And yes, I have two brothers who passed away in accidents. And that has a major trauma, a triggering impact on me. And it is one of the reasons why I have anxiety and depression, of course. But is it the sole reason I have anxiety and depression? Of course not. The sources, the origins of these things are so much more complicated than simply a series of events. And Ruth Franklin, in this wonderful biographer, she comes up with a story of Shirley Jackson, where she is. Shirley Jackson liked to give out this idea that she was an amateur witch specializing in small scale black magic and fortune telling with tarot cards. Did she give off this idea? Was it simply promotion, marketing for the book? I don't think so. I think Shirley Jackson had a really interesting, a very complicated relationship with these things, and she was a thoroughgoing materialist. She was not a religious person or a spiritual person in the normal way that we understand those sorts of terms. But she did have a really interesting take on black magic, on witchcraft, on the ability to tell the future through reading the tarot cards. For example, she allowed these very bold stories to be told about her, that she used witchcraft to break the leg of a publisher in a skiing accident that her husband and herself were in conflict with. That she actually used witchcraft to have this publishers have an accident whilst on a skiing holiday and to break their leg. She also allowed it to get out there that she used witchcraft to secure wins for the Brooklyn Dodgers, her favourite baseball team that she was quite obsessive about. But, there are also other things, like, as Ruth Franklin says, as her literary career took off and became more and more popular, as the literary career took off, her personal life careered out of control through a whole series of things, and she ended up really taken over by anxiety, by obviously depression, but also anxiety and agoraphobia. For the last few years of her life, she found it almost impossible to leave the family home. Certainly, she couldn't leave the home on her own. She had to be accompanied. And throughout most of her adult life, she was taking amphetamines to lose weight, tranquilizers to soothe her nerves. She was clearly heavily drinking alcohol, martinis and bourbon in particular. But she was clearly a heavy consumer of alcohol, again, in a desperate attempt at self-medication. And all of this cocktail, if you like, of heavy drinking with all this drug taking to soothe her nerves and to lose weight, it led her literally to die of a broken heart, of cardiac arrest, at the age of only 48. So young. And Ruth Franklin, in this biography, she comes to the conclusion, Ruth Franklin comes to the conclusion that Shirley Jackson was a rather haunted woman. But what was she haunted by? I don't think you can answer that question by only looking at a sequence of events. What was haunting Shirley Jackson? She had a complicated relationship with her mother. Her mother was a complicated person, obviously, who did a lot of damage to the young Shirley growing up, particularly the fat shaming. And Shirley apparently was a woman, even as a girl and a teenager, she was always overweight and very self-conscious about her weight. Hence all the drug taking to try and lose weight right throughout her life, which obviously contributed to her heart attack at the age of 48. And a lot of this insecurity about her body shape and weight came from her mother. But of course, her mother was complicated going back through the generations as well. I don't think her mother necessarily chose to be cruel or malicious or to put all this insecurity onto the young Shirley growing up through fat shaming. It's a complicated picture. Ruth Franklin also says, via the words of Shirley Jackson, that female power, if cruelly kept bottled up and repressed, turns lethal. And that was an idea that Shirley Jackson really clung to, really believed in, had this intuitive, really deep, strong feeling for. That, females were powerful. There is a genuine female power in the universe that is different from what males have. And if this female power is suppressed for long enough, bottled up, kept down, that eventually that female power turns lethal. It doesn't go away, it turns lethal. But again, Shirley Jackson clearly had very strong ideas that much of this is in our subconscious. You know, we don't choose to become lethal. We become lethal, or a woman can become lethal by being suppressed, bottled up, kept down all their life, and they become lethal. But it's clearly not a simple decision, is it? It's something which is in the subconscious, which has burst out to the surface. And Shirley Jackson, apparently, Ruth Franklin quotes in this book, you know, Shirley Jackson used to say, "What ails me is a nervous breakdown." And again, what made her have the breakdown? You know, it was not just because she was married to a serially unfaithful husband. You know, what kept Shirley Jackson? She had her own income. She, in actual fact, was the main provider of income in the home, because her husband, Stanley, was an academic and book critic who earned very little. His books sold for nothing. So Shirley Jackson actually generated most of the income. So what made Shirley Jackson stay in the unhappy marriage, to put up with his serial infidelities? If it obviously hurt her so much, why didn't she leave and start as an independent woman on her own with just her children? Because clearly she could have. You know, she was not financially dependent on him. And it's also really complicated because before we judge Stanley too badly and too harshly, he was never monogamous. And apparently he told Shirley before they got married, he did not believe in monogamy. He didn't really intend to be monogamous. And so I guess that's not a surprise that after they were married, he had one affair after another. I guess it goes back to the vows, the things that he agreed to, that he made vows about at the altar when he married Shirley. I accept that. But he did tell her from the start he did not intend to be monogamous. So why did Shirley put up with this? And it made her so unhappy. It clearly was one of the things at the, you know, as the source of her anxiety. And then it goes back to the fat shaming of as a little girl growing up in that home that she grew up in, and all of this complicated stuff again about nurture and nature, the subconscious and the way the subconscious impacts on the conscious. It's so much going on here. You know, Ruth Franklin also quotes Shirley Henderson that what Shirley Jackson was really interested in was this idea of the home as prison. You know, the home as site of disaster. And of course her own home was disastrous for Shirley. What a shame she didn't leave her husband and start her own independent life, and maybe she could have got on top of the alcohol. But as I just said, did she have any free will over that? You know, could she have easily simply left an unhappy marriage and started again, even though she was financially independent? And she could have done it. If she had have left and started up again, the consequences, financially at least, would have been far more dire for her unfaithful husband than for her. So why didn't she go? And another thing that Ruth Franklin quotes again in this book from Shirley Jackson, I keep calling Shirley Jackson Henderson, don't I? That's that wonderful English actor that I love so much. Oh boy, not Shirley Henderson, Shirley Jackson. Ruth Franklin quotes Jackson here also, that what Shirley was really interested in exploring through all her short stories and novels was this idea of the nonsense turned luminous. And again, that just shows me, you know, nonsense turned luminous. But what turned the lights on? You know, this is not about easy decision making, free will. You know, there's so much going on here. This is a wonderful biography. I have really, really enjoyed it. It's a rollicking good yarn. It's a page turner. I could not put this book down from start to finish. It's well written. Ruth Franklin uncovers these new diaries. She uncovers new letters. She uncovers new facts about Shirley Jackson's life, about the relationship with this serially unfaithful husband in Stanley. You know, the relationship between Shirley and her own children, and in particular, of course, much more going back to Shirley's childhood. There is also a suggestion uncovered in this book that Shirley Jackson, as a young married woman, was perhaps raped one night by her husband, by Stanley. The whole story was suppressed and Shirley refused to ever talk about it. But Ruth Franklin has uncovered apparently something in the diaries and in some secret letters that do talk about this in very oblique ways. And you know, you need to read between the lines. But clearly one night something did happen, and it would appear that one night, very early on in their married life, Stanley possibly had sex with Shirley unconsensually. And something is going on there. And that also had a big impact going down the years through the married relationship, the complicated married relationship between Shirley and Stanley. So this is a wonderful book. I love it. It's so well written. You know, you can see from the size of it, it has many, many details in it. It is a very, very detailed, carefully researched, well-written biography. But I don't think you can understand a life only by recounting a series of events. You know, if Shirley Jackson, if she was a haunted woman, what was haunting her? Clearly a haunting is something that is subconscious, that is working through that complicated interrelationship between nurture and nature. It is not something you have free will, self-autonomy over. You know, you don't choose to be haunted, to be racked by anxiety and depression to such an extent that you're on a cocktail of drugs and alcohol that is literally going to make you die of a broken heart at the age of 48. I want to know why Shirley Jackson was haunted. What was she haunted by? What was she haunted with? And while this is a wonderful book, I don't think it answers that question. And for me, too many literary biographies today don't answer this essential question. They don't take the subconscious seriously. They don't look at this whole idea of free will, about whether we do have free will, self-autonomy. You know, are we self-governing agents? They just assume that we are, and that you can understand a life simply by recounting the events of it. And I don't think that's good enough. So this is a fantastic, fantastic book. Really well written. I loved it. But I don't think, you know, it recounts the life, the story of a life. But for me, I don't think it ever tells me what Shirley Jackson was haunted by, what she was haunted with, and what was this terror, the suspense, this nonsense in her life, in the subconscious, that became luminous, that literally tore her apart and made her die from this broken heart at the age of 48. Literary biographies, I love them, but I think they need to do better. I want more theory. I want the subconscious. I want, you know, what it is that compels these people to act the way they do, to say the things they do. You know, I don't believe that Shirley Jackson had free will, self-autonomy. So I want to know, what were those compulsions? You know, what was the subconscious area that was compelling her to act and behave, to say things in certain ways? This is not a book for my money that answers these deeper questions. It's a beautifully written biography, incredibly detailed, but I don't think you can understand a life by simply recounting a series of events, whether those events are fortunate or unfortunate. Literary biography, they need to do more. Thank you, and bye for now.